What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to talk about the history of photo retouching from the Victorian period when photography was first invented all the way into modernity. So there's this misconception that photo retouching is a relatively new practice, that it came along with the invention of Photoshop, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, I would argue that most of the portraits we see that survive from the Victorian era have been retouched in some way, and I'll show you some evidence of them in this video. I'll also talk about different techniques that were used throughout the ages, from etching knives to India ink, all the way to colored pencils and things that were used to retouch photos in the 60s and 70s. So hopefully this video is interesting. I had a lot of fun researching it. There was a ton of stuff that I came across that I just don't have time to talk about, but it's certainly a very interesting topic, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. So without further ado, let's begin. So in 1860, a photo of politician John Calhoun was manipulated. His body was given the head of soon-to-be President Abraham Lincoln. And according to Wikipedia, this is credited as the first photo-manipulated photo. But that's not true. So the first photographic image was taken in approximately 1816, and the oldest surviving photograph, this one, was taken in 1826. In 1841, William Talbot patented the calotype, which was a method for photographic production that allowed the negative to be used to make multiple prints, which was brand new. Before that, you could only make one print per negative. 5 years later, in 1846, the actual first known act of photo manipulation took place, and it was by one of Talbot's colleagues, Calvert Jones. Jones had photographed 5 monks on a rooftop in Malta, but one of the monks disrupted the composition, and so he was retouched out using India ink on the negative. Being able to make multiple prints from the same negative meant that you could make a test print, and in that test print you could see if there was anything in the photo that you would rather have altered. So pretty much as soon as reusable negatives were invented, so was photo manipulation. This photo, called The Two-Headed Man, was taken in 1855, and it likely uses double exposure to achieve this spooky effect. Here's an excellent composite of portraits from 1867, and then here is a famous photo composition called Fading Away by Henry Peach Robinson, who was a famous photo compositor. Here's a photo called Spirit, which was supposedly taken during a seance, but is actually a composite image of several different portraits, as you can probably tell. And here is a photo of a man conducting an excellent feat of strength. Photo manipulations at this time would usually depict unusual apparitions, circus-worthy feats, strange animals, and other curiosities in what were called telltale postcards. So here are a few telltale postcards with farmers who have made bounties of unusual size. And here are some hunters and fishermen who've had incredible catches. And finally, here are some colorized examples for added authenticity. These manipulations were fun, but they were obviously not intended to trick the viewer into thinking that this was reality. These are just for fun. I would really love to talk all day about amusing photo manipulations from the past, because in researching this video, I found a ton of them. But in this video, I want to focus more on photo retouching and adding things and subtracting things from a photo in a way that is meant to convince the viewer that the photo they are looking at represents reality. Because while these fun manipulations make fun and entertaining postcards, other forms of manipulation have had a much more insidious effect on beauty standards and our cultural ideals, just as today's face-tuned influencers impact modern beauty standards. So let's talk about Victorian-era retouching. So in an excellent YouTube video called Exposing Victorian Influencers Who Face-Tuned Their Photos, YouTuber Bernadette Vanner looks at a few photos from the Victorian period and points out how everyone had perfect, flawless, glowing skin, very shapely waists, and she inspects certain photographs to point out evidence of photo retouching. Another YouTuber, fashion historian Caroline Zabrowska, has a similar video called How Victorians and Edwardians Faked Their Tiny Waists. So both of these videos are excellent resources. Go and check them out if you're interested in Victorian photo retouching. Looking closely at the photographic plates that were used to make albumin prints in the 1850s and 60s, we can clearly see touch-up marks on the emulsion side of the plate. This means that to retouch these photos, photographers would make alterations directly onto the negative. Common edits include skin smoothing, retouching out blemishes, smoothing under eye circles, pretty much all of the things that we edit in our own photos today. That doesn't seem like it's changed very much. Many texts and manuals survive from the Victorian era, giving advice to photographers on how to retouch their images. The Art of Retouching Photographic Negatives by Robert Johnson in 1898, and the British Photography Journal from 1875 taught that photographers should use a sharp, fine-pointed pencil to add highlights to a photo, and crosshatch with a blunted pencil to brighten up cheeks and other areas of the face. The book, Finishing the Negative, printed in 1901, advises the use of the round and round technique, pictured here, according to your own good taste, to add brightness to an image. Keep in mind also that because they were doctoring in negative, all of the colors are reversed, so bright areas on the negative would be dark areas in print and vice versa, so using a pencil to add brightness would be the perfect implement. The skin was often brightened so much that it really closely resembles a skin smoothing filter in modern times. Like, look at these. They look like skin smoothing filters were used, and they weren't. It was all done by hand, and it was called handwork. Wrinkles were commonly removed. Lines, blemishes, and freckles were considered imperfections at the time, which seems odd by modern sensibilities. Dark shadows under the eyes, in the corners of the mouth, and in the temple were frequently removed, and it seems like collarbones and chest texture were often frequently removed because the Edwardian silhouette had this weird pigeon front where women had to be really heavy on top and then have these teeny tiny little waists. And of course, these were just alterations to the portrait because Victorian photo retouchers would frequently retouch the body shape of the model as well. So there was this practice of placing a subject in front of a dark background so that the waist could be more easily taken in post. And in a lot of these pictures, as the two YouTubers who I mentioned before point out in their videos, you can actually kind of see where the waist used to be compared to where the waist is now. So you can see that they used to be quite a bit more realistic before they were retouched out. I'm pretty sure influencers also do this dark background thing today because you definitely don't see them posing in front of picket fences anymore, do you? But this practice of trimming the waistline got so extreme that we have this cultural misconception now that women in the Victorian era structurally altered their bodies using tight lacing and broke ribs and did all kinds of crazy things to achieve this wasp-like waist, when in fact they likely didn't, and it was probably photo manipulation, and it's still tricking modern audiences today. We also have physical evidence that these waistlines never really existed because many corsets survive from that time period. It actually wasn't that long ago, and even the smallest corsets have 20 to 22 inches around the waist. Nothing even close to the 18-inch waist that exists in cultural mythology. And corsets were worn with a gap in the back, so that gap could be anywhere from 2 to 4 inches, meaning that even the smallest corsets would have fit on slightly larger waists. So the Victorian era beauty standard seems completely unattainable naturally, very similar to our own beauty standard today, and it really does make me wonder if there's some correlation between the rise of studio photography and therefore photographic manipulation throughout the 1850s and 60s and the ever-increasing extremity of the beauty standard that dominated later on in the century and into the Edwardian period. And I would really love to talk about how photo retouching techniques impact cultural beauty norms and all of that, but that's a topic for another day and I feel like another YouTuber has covered it, so moving on. One more area of note for Victorian retouching. It seems like the aesthetic that the retouching was trying to achieve was very similar to that of painted portraits. And what I mean is like the brightness and the smoothness of the skin in these retouched images seems more like an oil painting than a picture of an actual person. And funnily enough, you can actually see portraiture transition from being mostly painted to mostly photographed in the course of about 60 years. So if you Google Georgian portrait and you Google Edwardian portrait, you'll see what I mean. The lighting techniques in Victorian photography also seem very similar to the lighting techniques used in Georgian painted portraits. In paintings, this look was a consequence of the fact that you had to use candle or lamp light in order to light the subject, because using natural light on a painting, if you're taking 8 hours to paint the painting, the light will change throughout the day because the sun is moving, and that will make it very difficult to get a consistent look in the painting. With photography though, these limitations didn't really apply because even the longest exposure time would see very little difference in sun placement. So it seems like the look of the lighting in painted portraits translated over into photography for no reason other than aesthetic preference, as did the practice of painting people in a way that augmented their best features and downplayed any perceived imperfections that may exist in reality. In my brief experience researching this video, I've actually found that the best way to tell a modern recreation of a Georgian portrait apart from an actual Georgian portrait was the fact that they include wrinkles and skin blemishes to a much more noticeable degree than the actual Georgian portraitists did. And modern recreations of Victorian photography stand out to me for the same reason. Here are some modern photographs taken using Victorian techniques, and they do look significantly different from Victorian photos because they're not retouched to the same degree. Interesting. There were also texts that survived from the Victorian period cautioning photographers against over-retouching their photos. The 1890 issue of Photographic Mosaic says, Over-retouching is one of the flagrant faults of modern photographers. It was very wrong of you to touch all the character out of the face of your otherwise fine old sea captain. It's very true, even over 100 years later. Likewise, an 1881 retouching guide commented, "An old man with no wrinkles is a ghastly and unnatural object." So, fast forward, if you would, past the Edwardian period into the 1920s and 1930s. Similar techniques are being used. We've got pencils, we've got etching knives, India inks being used still, but film has been invented. So photographs are now commonly taken on plastic, roller film, rather than these big glass or metal plates. The first Leica handheld camera was invented in 1925 using roller film, and photographic technology began to disseminate among the masses. We still see retouching from this time period, obviously, in fashion and beauty photography and most professional photography, but we also see unretouched everyday photography making an appearance. As photography made its way into the hands of amateurs, slightly more than it had been, unretouched images of family life began to make their way into the cultural sphere. So we see photography depicting a broader spectrum of people in a wider range of activities of daily life, featuring regular people. And so there are photos from this time that survived that likely haven't been retouched. But of course, photographic retouching was very much alive and well in the professional photography sphere. For example, this picture of Joan Crawford was painstakingly retouched over the course of 6 hours by vibrating a copy of the negative under the original and carefully removing wrinkles and freckles using a sharpened pencil. That's intense. These classic Hollywood beauties also bear signs of having had their skin retouched and their under-eye bags removed. Retouching techniques were also used in motion pictures, as were in-camera techniques designed to imitate that smooth skin look. So one technique that was used was rubbing Vaseline or some other gel on the lens of the video camera, and that would create this halation glow effect that would smooth out wrinkles and make it so that you didn't have to retouch as much on the film. There was also an alternative to photo retouching that was quite popular, and that was photo recreation. So a photo would be taken and an artist would redraw that photo with desired enhancements. So frequently that would include enlarging the bust and reducing the waist. And these images were used in pinups and advertisements. Through the 1930s and 1940s, we had World War II, and with it came a completely new use of photo manipulation and retouching. Governments began using photo manipulation for their own political purposes. So here's Benito Mussolini riding a horse, looking very heroic, and here's the unretouched version that shows a stableman holding the horse. Here's an image of Stalin from which the image of Nikolai Yezhov was retouched after his execution, and it also appears that in this photo Stalin's face was retouched to make it look brighter and less wrinkled and sunken. Here's an image of Hitler in a garden from which his political propaganda minister was ironically removed. And this was very skillfully done because the artist had to paint the garden in behind him. The reason why Goebbels was removed from this photo is still unknown, but it's likely because the two men had a brief falling out. I can imagine tensions are high. Here is one of the most famous instances of political retouching, in which Trotsky has been removed from a picture of Lenin giving a speech. This picture was retouched after Lenin and Trotsky had a very famous falling out over political divides. Propaganda abounded in World War II, as I'm sure we are all familiar with, and many techniques for misleading the public survive today, and photo manipulation is absolutely one of them. Moving on past the wartime years, here are some illustrations from a 1946 book called Shortcuts to Retouching for Commercial Photography. And I love this book. I think it does such a good job. I love this page that talks about pricing your work according to how long it takes you to retouch a photo. That is still very good advice today. Here's a really wild before and after that reminds me of like the modern day Instagram before and afters, where the final image looks completely unrecognizable from the original, but still really cool and dynamic and punchy. That's pretty neat. I also find this illustration very funny because in modern times we would probably have retouched out the smokestacks rather than adding them in post, but that's what they recommend you do to make the town look busier. And then there's also these pictures of all of the utensils and supplies that would have been used to retouch black and white negatives, which is also super interesting just to see everything laid out there. So yeah, love this book. After the 40s and 50s came the 60s, and with it came color film technology. And also, film cameras became much more accessible to the masses as commercialization of film photography increased. So finally, we've got a pretty wide breadth of images that were taken by non-professionals that survive today, and we can see what people actually looked like. But of course, retouching was still done in professional studios. All of these pictures of beautiful Hollywood icons from the 1960s were absolutely retouched. And as soon as I learned how the retouching was done, I began to see it more and more in these photos, and I was like, you know what? They were just normal people. Like, They were just normal people who got retouched into oblivion by overzealous photographers. So color photos were more difficult for obvious reasons to retouch than black and white photos. Black and white photos, all you needed was a pencil and some ink. But color photos, you need several different colors of pencil. I couldn't actually find any guides from the 60s and 70s on how to retouch color negatives, but I did find this guide from Kodak in 1998, which I believe probably applies. And according to this guide, the techniques used for color negatives are very similar to black and white, except you can't use an etching knife. So I didn't really talk much about etching knives, but they were an implement used to painstakingly remove parts of the photograph and scrape away parts of the ink on the negative. But because of the multiple layers of dye on a color negative, you can't just like scrape it away. So you can't use an etching knife for color retouching. But this Kodak guide recommends the use of colored pencils and dyes to neutralize the colors of blemishes on the face and other areas of the body. It also warns that films with higher saturation will require more retouching than lower saturated films because the colors on the face will stand out more. So like a red blemish in a higher saturation film will be very red. So it will be more likely to need retouching than on a lower saturated film where it might just blend in. Kodak actually sold colored dyes, and here's a really cool set from the 70s that was posted on Reddit. These were to be used with a very fine-tipped brush to retouch color negatives. They recommend that the two dyes that you are most likely to need are red and yellow and cyan. Alternatively, they advise that you can use pencils for retouching and that you will need a red, blue, and yellow pencil. And I can imagine that if I were to do this, I would certainly opt for the pencils over the dyes. It just seems easier to use. I'm not sure what the utility of the dyes is compared to the pencils, but that sounds like a better option. One of my favorite parts of this Kodak guide was this section for fixing common problems, and I just find it really interesting because red spots and facial blemishes, for example, will appear cyan in the negative, right? The opposite of the color that they are in the final print. And so in order to neutralize them, you will need the color opposite to how they appear in the negative, which would be red. So if you have a red blemish, color it in with a red pencil, and then when you make the print, it will have been neutralized. That's just weird, right? Like, that's weird, it's interesting, it's cool. Dark under eye bags require a cyan or blue-black pencil to neutralize. So you've got dark under eye circles, color them darker and they'll disappear in the print. Yellow teeth, for example, would require a dilute yellow dye to neutralize. I quite like this idea of photographers having a little toolkit of brushes and inks and pencils that they use to retouch, because I am a painter myself and I have missed the tactile aspect of creating as I've gotten more and more into photography. So I absolutely love photography, obviously, but I really wish that there was more like little fiddly bits that I got to collect. And at one point there would have been, so that's kind of cool. So here's a color photo from the 1960s that seems to have used a diffusion filter to create this sort of blurry, softened appearance. But there's also strategic retouching here to brighten her eyes and erase under eye bags. The retouching is somewhat obvious here, also on her bent hand and wrist area, which appears significantly blurrier and like softer than the rest of the image. Here's a photo of Grace Kelly, and I might be wrong, but I think you can actually see where it has been retouched. Like, some areas have like slightly yellower lines than others, and I don't think that's a quirk of the film. I think that's actually a yellow pencil being used. And here's another one of Grace Kelly that is much more skillfully done than the first, but you can still see areas where the whites of her eyes have been retouched, her eyes have been brightened, as well as her hair, and the strands of her hair have been given brightness in order to create more shine. Here is a retouched photo of Anne Margaret, and I'm making assumptions, of course, but I think you can actually see where the line of her hair has been doctored, because some strands just kind of disappear. So I think that they actually smoothed that out to make it a better, more consistent shape. And of course, her skin, as always, has been smoothed out completely. But here's a picture of Anne Margaret that I don't think has been doctored, and you can see that her skin actually did have texture, and she actually did have slight bags under her eyes, and she looked like a beautiful but human person. Finally, here's a photo of Natalie Wood that has clearly been retouched. Her face looks very similar to the skin smoothing filters that we use today. And when you can zoom in, you can see that the retoucher actually used the round and round method of creating tiny circles. Here is an unretouched photo of Natalie Wood for comparison. So yeah, I just thought those were interesting. I got into a bit of a rabbit hole looking at pictures of old celebrities from the 60s and inspecting them very closely for evidence of photo retouching once I learned how it was done. You could see it on almost every single one of these glamour shots. Of course, it was as widespread as it is today. So don't be fooled. These people were beautiful, but they weren't inhumanly gorgeous. They were regular people, and they had skin texture. Let it be known. So despite advancements in film processing and camera technology, the actual act of retouching remained relatively similar from the early days of photography all the way until the invention of color film, and even into the 80s and 90s. There was different products, different gels, different dyes, things that you could use, but by and large you were sitting at a retouching table with a pencil and a brush and doing it all by hand very, very painstakingly. But I'm sure you know what's coming next, because all of that would change in the 1990s when Photoshop 1.0 was released. So this photo, titled Jennifer in Paradise, is credited as being the very first photoshopped image. It was taken in 1987 on a beach in Bora Bora by Photoshop co-creator John Knoll. This photo was taken on film originally and scanned on a flatbed scanner. John Knoll was astounded by this capability. He is quoted as saying, "The fact that you could take an image from film, scan it, turn it into digits, and then manipulate those numbers and put it back onto a piece of film, it meant that there was literally no limit to what you could do with it in the middle." And he was right. Yeah, you could do literally anything with an image now, can't you? The image originally could only be viewed and edited on the Pixar image computer, which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and was not at all accessible to the average consumer. So John showed this technology to his brother, and it turns out that his brother Thomas was working on a similar technology that could actually run on a Macintosh Plus computer, which was much more available to consumers. So they decided to work together and further this application, and eventually they developed something that could be pitched to developers and sold as a final product. But there was a sticking point. There were so few digital images at this time in the early 90s that it was really hard to demonstrate what the application could actually do. You know, there were digital images, but they totally sucked, and there was very few of them. They visited Apple to demonstrate the product, and that's where Knoll actually got the opportunity to scan the film photograph that he had taken, which at the time was 4 inches by 6 inches, into a digital copy. And the flatbed scanner that he used was also a very rare technology. If you're wondering why he hadn't digitized it before, it's because he didn't have the capacity to do that. You could only find that technology at Apple Labs, apparently. So having digitized the image, Knoll would make his rounds and try and pitch this Photoshop software to different companies, and he would leave the image along with a copy of the software for the company's technicians to play around with. And apparently he would return and see what the technicians had done with the photo. And very often, apparently, they would clone the woman in the photo and make multiple copies of her, because that was something, I guess, that was easy enough to do in Photoshop. So in 1988, the brothers, Thomas and John Knoll, sold the distribution license for Photoshop to Adobe, and it was originally intended to be sold as an accompaniment to Adobe Illustrator. In 1990, Photoshop 1.0 was released by Adobe, and it was quite a hard sell at first because Photoshop actually required more computer memory than most personal computers came loaded with, or it could even be installed on most computers at the time. So it was a really cool software, but the hardware just wasn't there yet. It soon sold well enough that computers started developing more and more to keep up with it, and it wound up driving advancements in hardware that would allow personal computers to run Photoshop. In 1991, Adobe released Photoshop 2.0, and in 1994 came Photoshop 3.0, which added the now iconic feature, layers. I can't imagine working in Photoshop without layers. I'm sure it wasn't very fun. But for the first time in retouching history, it was possible to separately edit the background and the foreground of a photo, and also to make multiple copies of that photo and test out different edits and have that be non-permanent and non-destructive. Which is cool, and a far departure from the days of painstakingly retouching the original glass slide of a photograph. The first commercially available digital camera released in 1991 by Logitech, and it was called the Photoman. And it was vertically oriented, so it kind of looks like a smartphone, and there's like this famous video of a fight, I think with Mike Tyson in 1995, and people are like, oh my god, they're holding a smartphone. No, they're probably holding a Logitech Photoman digital camera, but it took tiny photos. The photos it took were 376 by 240 pixels wide, and it cost around $1,000, which in today's money, interestingly, is around $2,000. And I didn't realize that the value of money had literally doubled since the 1990s, but apparently it has. Yeah, so $2,000 you can get tiny, tiny, tiny photos that I think I could probably take on my calculator now. But you could edit these tiny photos in Photoshop, which was very cool at the time, and well worth the price for some industry professionals. In 1995, Adobe purchased the complete rights to Photoshop for, wait for it, $34.5 million. And the Knoll brothers were multimillionaires. In 1996, Photoshop 4 was released, which added new actions and adjustment layers. This would allow designers to apply effects to groups of layers and also to automate certain effects. Very cool. I won't go too much into detail about the complete update history of Photoshop because there's an update basically every year all the way until now, but there are a few more advancements that I want to touch on. So Photoshop 5 added even more features, and the ability to undo more than one action was added, which is incredibly helpful, as well as the magnetic lasso tool. In 2001, Adobe released Photoshop Elements, which is how I learned Photoshop, funnily enough, which was essentially a stripped down version of Photoshop that had only the features that beginners and average users would need. It didn't have all of the extra stuff that industry professionals use, because that's just there to complicate things for people who are just trying to learn. Elements further democratized the ability to retouch photos, making the art more accessible to hobbyist photographers and average computer owners. For basically the first time, retouching could be done by anyone who owned the software. It wasn't exclusive to industry professionals, which, for better or for worse, it's really not gone that well, has it? Photoshop 7 added the healing brush tool, and this actually automates the work that darkroom technicians have been laboring over for more than a century. The technology behind this tool has certainly improved since it was added, but even at the very beginning, it represents a huge milestone in the history of photographic retouching. So moving on from the history of Photoshop, because we all know how that's gone, in 2005, Apple computers released a software called Photo Booth that came preloaded on all of their Macintosh laptops that had this little built-in camera. So Photo Booth came with a variety of effects. It was the precursor essentially to modern-day facial filters that would transform your image in real time, which was fascinating. Trust me, I had a computer that had Photo Booth on it in 2006, and it was fascinating. If you had never seen anything like this before, something render in real time, it was just bizarre watching your face go back and forth. You know, there was this one filter called Pencil Sketch that would turn you into like a tacky watercolor sketch. To modern eyes, it looks really tasteless, but back then it was like, oh my God, this is incredible technology. There's a filter that made your mouth small or your eyes big or made multiple copies of yourself. There was a variety of different colorful filters that you could choose from, and it was like, it blew my little middle school mind. And this, I think, was really the beginning of the true democratization of photo manipulation and photo retouching. So in 2011, a new app hit the market, and it was called Snapchat. And Snapchat used augmented reality to scan your face and map a filter in real time onto your face. It was absolutely wild, enough to completely fascinate everybody at the time. Just like how Victorian audiences were fascinated by the telltale photographs that depicted strange oddities that they knew couldn't be true but looked so real, that's the exact fascination that I would gaze upon a picture of myself with little dog ears tacked on top. Snapchat provided filters, but it didn't allow you to tweak the effects of those filters once applied. And this created space for a new app that emerged in 2013 called Facetune. So Facetune let you take a picture and then gave you a variety of options to tweak that picture. And if you've ever used Facetune, you're probably familiar with it. You can whiten teeth, reshape your face, pull in your waist, enlarge your bust, whatever you want to do. True democratization of photo retouching technology. Like, straight up, that's it. Everybody can do it. Anybody has access to it. It's just like that. If you've got a smartphone, then you can retouch a photo. In 2016, Facetune 2 introduced live action editing. So you could actually edit your face in real time. You didn't even have to take a photo. You could just edit it. It's crazy. And suddenly the same techniques that can be used to retouch a photo can be used to retouch a video to the exact same effect in the exact same amount of time. It's wild. It's obviously crazy to look back at the last 30 years and see how much retouching technology has changed, especially when we had like almost a century and a half of relatively similar practices, and then boom, 30 years of just radical change. But that's how it's worked for a lot of different technologies, and I'm sure there's nothing new about that. We've all had plenty of time to reflect on how bizarre it is that technology is accelerating at this breakneck pace, so I won't dwell on it. But yeah, it was a bit of a wild ride, like reading about the first century of photographic retouching and then the last 20 years, and I'm like, whoa. But yeah, I think looking back at this video and the research that I did, it is also interesting to realize that the elements that Victorians retouched out of a photo were very similar to the elements that we retouch out of photos. And I think it's really interesting to see these very different technologies being used to achieve very similar aesthetic goals. I guess that's people for you. But yeah, so anyway, that is the video. That is all of the information that's pretty much up to present day. I didn't want to go too much into all of the different apps because there's just so many now, but I thought that was a really interesting little history of photographic retouching, seeing how it's changed throughout the years, seeing the different techniques, especially the physical ones. I just love that. Yeah, hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching. Thank you for listening. I have been talking for like an hour and a bit now, so I'm hoping that the video is not going to be that long, but Certainly it has taken a lot of time to research this video, so if you like it, please leave a like. You can subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this, and you can leave a comment letting me know exactly what you think, which photos you thought were most interesting, which techniques you want to know more about, etc., etc. I'll see you guys next week with a new video. I think it's probably going to be a street photography one, but we don't know yet. We'll find out. And in the meantime, stay sharp, and don't forget to keep shooting. Bye, guys.